Hey guys, tonight I need to warn you. What you're about to hear might completely ruin every Viking romance novel you've ever enjoyed. You know how we picture Vikings, right? Big burly warriors, sweeping maidens off their feet, all passion and adventure. Yeah, about that. The reality of Viking love was somehow stranger, more calculated, and occasionally more progressive than anything Hollywood could dream up. And before you ask, yes, there were rituals involving swords. No, not in the way you're thinking. Tonight we're diving into a world where your wedding night had witnesses, where divorce was easier than in 1950s America, and where writing the wrong kind of love poem could literally get you outlawed. We're talking about people who saw marriage as a business merger, but also believed that the gods themselves blessed unions with a hammer. A hammer, guys. So where are you all tuning in from tonight? Let me know in the comments. Especially if you're watching from anywhere in Scandinavia. I'm curious if any of these traditions survived in some form where you are, and what time is it where you're watching. This feels like one of those 2 a.m. rabbit hole topics, doesn't it? Maybe grab some mead if you've got it, or you know what, just pour whatever you've got. We're about to get weird with the Vikings, and you might need it. Oh, and if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the bizarre corners of history, maybe hit that subscribe button, but only if you actually want to. I'm not your mom, so let me take you back to a wedding feast in 9th century Norway. The hall reeks of smoke and sweat and ale. You're 15 years old, and your father just shook hands with a man you've seen maybe twice in your life. Congratulations, you're getting married next month. This is where we need to shatter that first myth about Viking romance. Love, that was a luxury most couldn't afford. Marriage in the Viking Age was about as romantic as a corporate merger, and honestly, that's exactly how they treated it. Let's talk about the munder, the bride price. Then before you get all worked up, this wasn't buying a woman like cattle. Well, not exactly. The munder was more like a security deposit. The groom's family paid it to the bride's family. But here's the twist. It actually became the woman's property after marriage. Think of it as the world's first prenup, except it was mandatory, and everyone at the feast knew exactly how much you were worth. The negotiations could take months. I'm not exaggerating. Families would send representatives back and forth, haggling over land rights, livestock, silver, and sometimes straight-up political alliances. Your dad might throw in 3 cows and fishing rights to sweeten the deal. The other family might counter with demands for help during the harvest season. And the women, they actually had more say than you'd think. Sure, fathers technically arranged most marriages, but Norse women could own property, request divorces, and run households. If a woman really truly objected to a match, she could make everyone's life miserable enough that they'd reconsider. There are saga accounts of women basically going on strike until their families caved. One of my favorite examples comes from Laxdala saga. This woman named Gudrun gets married 4 times, and each marriage is this complex chess game of property and politics. She's not some passive princess. She's actively scheming to improve her position each time. By her 4th marriage, she's one of the wealthiest landowners in Iceland. The age thing is gonna bother you. I know. Girls could legally marry at 12, boys at 14. But here's what the sagas don't tell you. Most people didn't actually marry that young, unless they were super high status. Your average Viking farmer's daughter probably married around 16 to 18, to a guy in his early 20s. Still young by our standards, but not the child bride situation you might imagine. What really gets me is how transactional they were about the whole thing. Families literally had meetings where they'd discuss which daughters were most marriageable and which alliances would bring the most benefit. It's like if your parents sat down with spreadsheets to decide who you should date based on their LinkedIn profiles. But wait, it gets weirder. The morning gift, or morgengifu, was basically a payment the groom gave his bride after their wedding night. Yeah, after. Then the amount depended on, well, let's just say it was a performance review. The better the wedding night went, the more generous the morning gift. Can you imagine? Here's 20 silver pieces. Thanks for last night. Vikings, man. The really wild part. Sometimes the negotiations fell apart after everything was agreed. There's this saga where a guy named Thorstein agrees to marry this girl. The families shake on it. Everyone's happy. Then he finds out her father exaggerated about some land holdings. Thorstein straight up cancels the wedding. The girl's family is furious, but he's technically within his rights because the contract was based on false information. And that's the thing. These marriage contracts were legally binding documents. They'd have witnesses, usually 6 men from each family. They'd specify exactly what each party was bringing to the marriage. What would happen if someone died? Who got? What if they divorced? Vikings were writing prenups 1,000 years before they became a Hollywood thing. The sagas are full of women who gamed this system brilliantly. They'd marry strategic first husbands, build up their wealth, divorce them. Oh yeah, Viking women could initiate divorce pretty easily, and then remarry into better positions. There's this one woman, the deep-minded, who basically built a shipping empire through strategic marriages and some convenient widowhoods. But here's what kills me. Within all this cold calculation, real affection did develop. The same sagas that describe these business transactions also tell stories of couples who ended up genuinely devoted to each other. They just got there backwards from how we do it now. Fall in love first, then get married. Nah, get married, combine your sheep herds, have 6 kids, then maybe develop some feelings along the way. It's weirdly practical when you think about it. They knew passion faded, but a good land deal, that's forever. So you've been promised to someone. Great. Now what? Well, if you thought Viking courtship was all about dragging women off by their hair, prepare for disappointment. The reality was more like a really intense poetry slam, with deadly consequences. Vikings had rules about approaching women, so many rules. You couldn't just walk up to someone's daughter and start flirting. That was a good way to end up with an axe in your skull. Instead, you had to be subtle, and by subtle, I mean you had to compose elaborate poems, comparing her eyes to the fjords or whatever. Here's the thing about Viking men, lads. They were expected to be poets. Yeah, the same guys who went raiding monasteries, spent their evenings crafting verses about their feelings. The sagas call it mansun, love songs. But here's the catch. If your poetry was too good, too passionate, too convincing, you could be outlawed for sorcery. I'm not making this up. Vikings believed that really good love poetry was basically a magic spell that could enchant women against their will. There's this amazing story in Cormac's saga, where this dude Cormac falls hard for Steinga. He starts composing these incredible verses about her, and her father is like, nope, this is witchcraft, get him out of here. They literally banned him from the district, because his poetry was too fire. But let's say your poetry was just the right level of romantic without being suspiciously magical. What then? Well, you still couldn't just show up at her door. You needed a proper introduction, usually through a mutual friend, or at a public gathering, and even then, you couldn't be alone together. Vikings were super weird about unmarried people being alone. They called it secret meetings, and it was scandalous. The gift giving though, that was crucial, but you had to be careful. Too expensive, and you looked desperate. Too cheap, and you insulted her family. The sweet spot was something personal but not too intimate. A nice brooch, maybe, some imported beads. One saga mentions a guy giving his intended a puppy, which honestly sounds adorable, and the women weren't just sitting there waiting. They had their own ways of showing interest. A woman might accidentally drop her head, covering when a certain someone walked by. She might serve him first at a feast, or make sure his cup was always full. One saga describes a woman who kept finding excuses to walk past a guy's booth at the market, which is basically the Viking equivalent of stalking someone's Instagram. The families meanwhile were watching all of this like hawks. If things got too friendly too fast, they'd step in. There's a great bit in Gisla Saga where this couple is getting a little too cozy at a feast, and the girl's brothers literally form a human wall between them. Cock-blocking Viking style. But my favorite part, the consequences for improper advances. If a man touched a woman inappropriately, and we're talking about like touching her hand without permission, her male relatives had the legal right to kill him. Just straight up murder. Totally legal. The law codes are very specific about this. Touch her sleeve, that's a fine. Touch her hair, that's exile. Touch anything else, hope you've made peace with your gods. There's this incredible story where a man grabs a woman's cloak clasp, just the clasp, and her brothers hunt him down across half of Iceland. He ends up having to pay them off with basically his entire fortune just to keep his head attached. The weird part is that all this propriety went out the window once you were married. Vikings were pretty open about sex within marriage, but during courtship, you'd better keep those hands to yourself and stick to the poetry. Oh, and here's a fun detail. Vikings had a concept called bedding witnesses. When a couple finally did get together, legally, there had to be witnesses to confirm the marriage was completed. We'll get to that absolute nightmare in a bit, but just imagine knowing that your uncles are standing outside, waiting for confirmation. Vikings really knew how to kill the mood. Alright, so the courtship didn't end in bloodshed, the families have agreed on terms, and somehow everyone's still speaking to each other. Time for a Viking wedding. And friends, this is where things get properly weird. First, we need to talk about timing. Vikings were obsessed with lucky days. They'd consult runes, check the moon phases, make sure the gods were in a good mood. Friday was the favorite night of Frigg's Day, named after Odin's wife, goddess of marriage, but not just any Friday. It had to be during the waxing moon, preferably in late summer or early fall, when everyone was flush with harvest goods and could actually afford to throw a proper feast. The preparation started with what I can only describe as a ritual death. No, seriously, the bride had to symbolically die as a maiden and be reborn as a wife. This involved a ceremonial bath that was way more intense than your average spa day. Picture this: female relatives would strip the bride down, lead her to a bathhouse, and basically conduct a funeral for her unmarried self. They'd remove every symbol of her maidenhood, jewelry, clothes, especially her kransen, this gorgeous circlet that unmarried girls wore. They'd pack all of it away like grave goods. Then they'd wash her with special herbs, each one with some mystical significance. Birch for fertility, evergreen for eternal life, meadow sweet to sweeten her temperament. I swear, it was like they were marinating her. Meanwhile, the groom was going through his own bizarre ritual. His friends would steal him away for what was essentially a Viking bachelor party, except instead of strippers there was more symbolic death. They'd take his sword, and every Viking man had an ancestral sword, and bury it. The groom had to dig it up, symbolically retrieving his manhood and warrior spirit from the earth. Then they'd all get absolutely plastered on mead and tell stories about their raids. So I guess some bachelor party traditions are eternal. The morning of the wedding, things got even stranger. The bride would dress in her absolute finest. We're talking layers of linen, a woolen overdress dyed in expensive colors, all her best jewelry. But here's the kicker: she'd wear her hair loose and flowing, which was scandalous. Married women always covered their hair, so this was her last chance to let it all hang out, literally. Then came the crown, not the kransen she gave up. Nart was gone forever. Instead, she'd wear a family heirloom bridal crown, often made of silver, sometimes strung with tiny dangling charms that made music when she walked. Some of these crowns were so valuable they were shared between villagers. Imagine having to schedule your wedding around crown availability. The groom meanwhile would show up armed to the teeth, sword, axe, sometimes a shield, because nothing says I love you like showing up to your wedding ready for battle. He'd also carry a new sword, not his ancestral one but one he'd probably commissioned specially for the occasion. This was important. We'll get to why in a second. The actual ceremony was minimal. Vikings didn't really do long vows or elaborate rituals. The couple would exchange swords, his new one for one from her family. This symbolized the protection each family offered the other. Then they'd exchange rings, but get this, they wore them on their sword hands, not the left hand like we do. The rings were usually simple bands, sometimes with runic inscriptions. One surviving ring literally just says Thorfast owns Vigdis, romance. But the real star of the show,
Thor's hammer.
Someone, usually the groom's father, bleaches a ceremonial hammer in the bride's lap and invoke Thor's blessing for fertility. Just placed it right there, in her lap, while everyone watched. The symbolism wasn't exactly subtle. Then came the feast, and Vikings knew how to party. We're talking 3 days minimum, sometimes up to a week if the families were wealthy. The archaeological record shows some wedding feasts went through absolutely insane amounts of food. One site in Norway showed evidence of over 50 cattle being slaughtered for a single wedding. That's not counting sheep, pigs, fish, and enough meat to float a longship. The bride and groom had to share a loving cup, literally drink from the same vessel, while everyone watched and made increasingly crude toasts. The sagas record some of these toasts, and let me tell you, Vikings had no filter. They'd toast to the couple's future children, speculate about the wedding night, make jokes about sword measurements. Your drunk uncle at modern weddings has nothing on Viking wedding guests. And speaking of the wedding night, remember those witnesses I mentioned? Yeah, it's time for that horror show. 6 men, 3 from each family, would escort the couple to the bridal chamber. They'd watch them get into bed together, in the bed. Then they'd leave, but they'd stand right outside the door. The couple had to announce when the marriage was consummated. I cannot emphasize enough how real this was. The witnesses were there to prevent either party from later claiming the marriage wasn't valid, because in Viking law, no consummation meant no marriage. So these 6 dudes would just stand there, probably still drunk from the feast, waiting for confirmation that the deed was done. One saga describes a bride who was so mortified by this tradition that she made her new husband wait until the witnesses got tired and left. Power move, maybe, but it also meant their marriage was technically questionable for years afterward. The morning after brought the morning gift ceremony. The groom would present his gift to his new wife in front of everyone, basically announcing to the world that yes, they were now officially married in every sense. The size of the gift often reflected satisfaction levels. The whole hall would judge based on how generous he was being. And here's my favorite detail. The keys. The new wife would receive the keys to the household, worn on a chain at her waist. These weren't just practical, they were a symbol of her authority. She now controlled the storerooms, the treasury, basically all the valuable stuff. Viking men might have ruled outside, but inside the home, that was the woman's domain, and those keys proved it. The whole thing was this perfect mixture of sacred ritual, business transaction, and absolute social mortification. But hey, at least the party was good. So you've survived the witnesses, the marriage is consummated, and somehow you managed not to die of embarrassment. Congratulations, you're now a Viking wife. But honey, the weird is just getting started. That morning gift I keep mentioning, time to talk about what it really meant. The Morgan Gifu wasn't just a thanks for last night present, it was literally the foundation of a woman's financial independence. This gift became her personal property, separate from the dowry, separate from household goods. Her husband couldn't touch it, her father couldn't reclaim it. If things went south, this was her emergency fund. The smart women negotiated their morning gifts before the wedding. Yeah, that's right. Some Viking ladies were out here getting their post-wedding night payment rates locked in contractually. There's a record of one woman who demanded a specific farm as her morning gift. The groom tried to offer silver instead, and she basically said farm or no wedding night. She got the farm, but let's talk about what happened after all the ceremony. You're married now, which in Viking society meant you immediately had a job producing heirs. The pressure was insane. If a woman didn't get pregnant within the first year, people started whispering, was she cursed? Was he inadequate? Were the gods angry? The remedies they tried, Lord help us. Women would eat special herbs, wear fertility amulets shaped like tiny penises, I'm not kidding, and make offerings to Freya and Frasier. One archaeological find included what scholars politely call a fertility object, but which was basically a wooden dildo with runic inscriptions asking for children. Vikings had no chill. If pregnancy didn't happen after 3 years, that was actually grounds for divorce. But here's where it gets interesting. It was usually assumed to be the man's fault. Viking women could divorce their husbands for impotence, and the sagas suggest this wasn't uncommon. Imagine having to explain to the whole village that your wife left you because you couldn't perform. The shame was real. Daily married life was actually pretty egalitarian by medieval standards. The husband ruled outside the house, farming, raiding, trading, all that. But inside, that was the wife's kingdom. Remember those keys? They weren't ceremonial. She controlled the food stores, managed the slaves and servants, decided what got bought and sold. If a husband wanted to trade away household goods, he legally needed his wife's permission. The sagas are full of wives who ran their households like CEOs. They'd manage textile production, and Viking Age textiles were incredibly valuable, like having a printing press for money. They'd oversee the brewing, the dairy work, the preservation of food for winter. Some women ran essentially commercial operations out of their homes. And if your husband went Viking, yes, it's a verb, it means going raiding. You were basically a single parent and business owner for months at a time. Some men never came back, and their wives would just keep going. There's this amazing woman named Outlawed the Deep-Minded, whose husband died on a raid. She took over his shipping business, moved the entire operation to Iceland, and became one of the most powerful settlers there. But here's the dark side. Concubines. Viking men, especially wealthy ones, often had friller concubines, or secondary wives, and the primary wife just had to deal with it. The concubines lived in the household, had recognized children who could inherit, and sometimes wielded significant influence. The wife's only real power was that her children were considered legitimate, while concubine children were not, unless the father decided to recognize them, which he totally could. Okay, so we've covered the business deals, the rituals, the witnesses standing outside your bedroom door. But what about actual love? Did Vikings fall in love? Oh boy, did they ever. And when they did, it usually ended in bloodshed. See, the thing about Viking society is that it ran on 2 parallel tracks. There was the official track, arranged marriages, proper procedures, witnesses for everything, and then there was the human track, where people had feelings and made terrible decisions. The sagas are basically a 1,000-year-old collection of what could go wrong. Stories. Let's start with the love poetry again, because this is where things got spicy. Remember how I said good poetry could get you outlawed for sorcery? Well, some guys decided that was worth the risk. There's this poet named Gunnlaug, who fell for a woman named Helga the Fair. Problem: she was already promised to someone else. Did that stop him? Hell no. This absolute madman composed verse after verse about her beauty, each one more elaborate than the last. He compared her to Freya, called her the sun of his life, said her hair was spun from gold. The poetry was so intense that her father tried to have Gunnlaug killed multiple times. The whole thing ended with Gunnlaug and Helga's husband having a duel to the death over poetry. Vikings did not mess around with their creative writing. But here's what gets me. Adultery was somehow both totally forbidden and weirdly common. The law codes are clear. A man could kill another man for sleeping with his wife. No trial needed. caught in the act. That's a legal execution. But the sagas are also full of affairs that everyone apparently knew about, but nobody did anything about. The double standard was real though. A man sleeping with another man's wife, death sentence. A man sleeping with an unmarried woman, that's just a fine payable to her father or guardian. A woman sleeping with anyone other than her husband, well, that depended on whether her husband had concubines. If he did, she might get away with it. If he didn't, she could lose everything: property, children, social standing. There's this wild story in Laxdala saga, where Gudrun, remember her, 4 marriages, has this intense emotional affair with a guy named Kachan. They never physically consummate it, but they spend hours talking, exchanging meaningful looks, composing cryptic verses to each other. Everyone knows what's going on. The sexual tension is so thick you could cut it with a Viking axe. But Kachan's best friend Bolli is also in love with Gudrun, so while Kachan is away, Bolli spreads rumors that Kachan has married someone else. Gudrun, heartbroken and pissed, marries Bolli out of spite. When Kachan comes back and finds out what happened, things escalate quickly. Long story short, everyone ends up dead because of feelings. The consequences for unauthorized love could be brutal. There's a thing called full outlawry. Basically, you're kicked out of society. Anyone can kill you without legal consequences. You can't own property, can't seek shelter, can't even be buried in consecrated ground, all because you couldn't keep it in your pants. But some people thought love was worth it. There are these incredible stories of outlawed couples living in the wilderness together, building hidden homes in the mountains, surviving on love and stolen sheep. It's romantic until you realize most of them froze to death, or were hunted down like animals. The really messed up part, even legitimate love within marriage could be dangerous if expressed too publicly. There's this concept of unmanliness. If a man was too affectionate with his wife, too devoted, too obviously in love, other men would mock him. They'd question his masculinity, his warrior spirit. Loving your wife too much was literally considered a weakness. One saga tells of a man who refused to go raiding because he didn't want to leave his new bride. His friends staged an intervention. They showed up at his house, dragged him to the ship, and basically forced him to go pillage some monasteries because his devotion to his wife was embarrassing them all. But the women had their own ways of weaponizing love. There's this thing called goading. Basically, women would manipulate their men into violence by questioning their honor or masculinity. Oh, you're fine with that guy insulting your family. I guess you're not the man I thought you were. Next thing you know, someone's getting an axe to the face. The most famous example is Bergmora in Njal's saga. She systematically goaded her husband and sons into a blood feud that lasted decades and killed dozens of people. Why? Because someone insulted her at a feast 20 years earlier. She used love, loyalty, and masculine pride like weapons, and she was terrifyingly good at it. And then there's the supernatural angle. Vikings believed that intense love or lust could literally curse people. There are stories of women who died of heartbreak and came back as drag undead to torment their former lovers. Men who were rejected might perform rituals to make women fall in love with them, which was considered the darkest kind of magic. The love stories that survived in the sagas are almost never happy ones. Tragic love was apparently more memorable than successful romance. Maybe that's why the Vikings were so careful with all their rules and contracts and witnesses. They'd seen what happened when passion overruled sense. But here's the thing that really gets me. For all their violence and strict codes, Vikings understood that love made people crazy. The sagas don't condemn the lovers, even when their actions lead to disaster. There's this sense of of course he killed 7 people to avenge his beloved's honor. What else would he do? Love was recognized as a force of nature, as dangerous and unstoppable as the sea. And that, friends, is maybe the strangest part of all. These people who planned marriages like business mergers, who had witnesses for their wedding nights, who could divorce over a too low neckline, they also believed that true love was worth dying for. They just preferred you didn't. Alright, deep breath. We need to talk about the parts of Viking love that were genuinely horrific. No jokes here, just the brutal reality of what some people endured. Bride kidnapping was a thing, not the ceremonial, steal the bride, game some cultures play at weddings. Actual kidnapping. Usually it happened during raids. Vikings would attack a settlement, and among the loot and livestock, they'd take women. These women would become wives, concubines, or slaves, and the distinction often depended on their social status back home, and whether anyone was likely to come looking for them with an army. The sagas try to romanticize some of these stories. They'll tell you about raiders who fell in love with their captives, how the women eventually came to love their captors, how they lived happily ever after. But let's be real, these were traumatized people, making the best of horrific situations. Stockholm Syndrome isn't romantic. There's archaeological evidence from Dublin, one of the biggest Viking slave markets, showing that captured women were literally branded. Like cattle, some were sold as brides to men who couldn't afford proper marriages, others became concubines. The lucky ones might become wives if they were highborn enough, and their captor needed political legitimacy. Forced marriages within Viking society were more subtle but equally devastating. Sure, technically a woman could object to a marriage, but what happened when she did? Best case scenario, her family would be disappointed. Worst case, she'd be beaten, starved, or threatened until she agreed. The sagas mention women who went on hunger strikes to avoid marriages, and their families force-feeding them. Then there's what happened to unwanted children. Viking society valued strength, and children who were born disabled or sickly faced a grim fate. Exposure was legal, leaving infants outside to die. Usually it happened before the child was formally acknowledged by the father. Once a baby was given a name and accepted into the family, killing it became murder. But before that, it was just disposal. Girls were more likely to be exposed than boys, especially in poor families who couldn't afford dowries. The archaeological record shows settlements with suspicious gender imbalances, way more adult men than women. Do the math on what that means. And about those tragic love stories I mentioned, sometimes women who lost their husbands were expected to follow them into death. This wasn't common, let me be clear about that. Most Viking widows remarried or lived independently, but in some high-status families, particularly among Swedish Vikings, there are accounts of widow burning. The most detailed account comes from Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who witnessed a Viking funeral along the Volga. He describes a slave girl who volunteered to join her master in death. The quotation marks are doing a lot of work there. She was given drinks and herbs, probably to drug her, then subjected to ritual rape by the dead man's companions, before being strangled and stabbed simultaneously. The Vikings told Ibn Fadlan this was an honor. He was horrified. Even within marriages, violence was permitted to a degree that's sickening. Men could beat their wives for disobedience, though excessive violence was frowned upon. Excessive being the key word. Some violence was just expected. Women could divorce husbands for extreme abuse, but they needed witnesses, and who was going to testify against a violent man? The sagas gloss over a lot of this. They'll mention in passing that someone disciplined his wife, or that a woman was difficult before her marriage. Reading between the lines reveals generations of women trapped in brutal situations with limited options for escape. But here's what I want you to remember. For every horror story, there were also women who fought back, who divorced abusive husbands, who refused forced marriages, who found ways to protect their children. The system was stacked against them, but they weren't passive victims. They were survivors in a world that could be incredibly cruel. The Vikings gave us amazing art, poetry, exploration, and yes, some progressive ideas about women's rights. But they also gave us examples of how love and marriage can be twisted into tools of oppression. It's important to see both sides, the fascinating and the horrific, to really understand these people. Because they were people, complex, contradictory, capable of both tenderness and brutality, just like us, really, except with more axes. And we're back. How are you feeling? That was a lot, I know. It's strange, isn't it? Viking women could own property, run businesses, divorce freely, and command households. They had rights that women wouldn't see again in Europe for 1,000 years. Your great-great-grandmother in the 1800s had less freedom than a Viking wife in 800 AD. Let that sink in for a minute. But they also lived in a world where love poetry could get you killed, where your wedding night had an audience, where marriage was a merger and love was dangerous. A world of contradictions, where progressive ideas existed alongside brutal traditions. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Progress isn't linear. Rights can be gained and lost. What seems advanced in one area can coexist with what's barbaric in another. The Vikings remind us that human societies are messy, complicated, and resistant to simple narratives. So next time you see a Viking romance novel at the bookstore, you'll know the real story was stranger, more complex, and occasionally more terrifying than fiction, but also in its own weird way, more human. Thanks for going on this journey with me tonight. If you made it this far, you're my kind of history nerd. Drop a comment. I'd love to know what surprised you most. Until next time, stay curious, my friends, and maybe be grateful for your witness-free wedding night.